A lot of people will keep their perfume in the bathroom. That I am here to tell you, please don't do that because it ruins the perfume. So even though it was on the bottom of the ocean, kind of ideal conditions for saving your scents because they were in the satchel, they were completely sealed up, and they were in a cold, dark place for 90 years. So that's kind of why they were still very strong. And even the ones that were broken, the reason why they still smelled was because they hadn't been broken the entire 90 years. They were only broken as they were rising to the top.
Titanic Talk with Nelson Aspen and Alexandra Boyd. Here we feature stories from the independent documentary Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, and everything to do with the iconic ship. From James Cameron's epic, groundbreaking movie to the history and legacy of Titanic herself. Actors, historians, authors, descendants, and fans come here to talk about Titanic. This is your first-class ticket to everything aboard the Ship of Dreams.
Well, one of the nicest things about doing Titanic Talk is the circle of friends that always keeps expanding. And it was on one of our many Titaniac affiliated Instagram sites that I'd seen a mention of, well, I'm not going to spoil it yet. But one thing led me to our guest today, and my co-host, Alexandra Boyd, the filmmaker behind Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, is going to introduce us to a new friend that I think you're going to be very excited to meet. I am.
I'm listening to you make the introductions, or almost make the introductions, and I think you could almost say that it was your nose that led you there. And I have a more than a passing interest in what we're going to talk about today, because I used to work at a perfume shop in East Dulwich in London, and Jen Siems has her own perfume shop in Seattle, which is just across the Puget Sound from where I live, very remotely in a forest. If you've been listening enough to us, you'll know I have barking pugs and 6 acres of rainforest. So I'm very remote. But then, because of the power of the internet, we have been brought together today with Jen. Welcome to Titanic Talk. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on. The Titanic movie came out when I was in middle school, so I've been, waiting for this day for, more than 20 years. So.
But what we haven't explained is the connection. The reason you're here is because of your perfume abilities, expertise, and the history. The post that I saw was that there was this gentleman aboard the Titanic who had survived, and you can tell us more about his story. But what didn't survive were his vials of perfume that were recovered from the wreck many years later. And you did a YouTube video on this very subject. That's how we found you. So it's fascinating to think about. We see so many personal items, shoes, and those are always seem to be the most touching when we look at things recovered from Titanic. But tell us the story of the perfumes as it relates to Titanic.
Yes. So I should start by saying that I'm a perfume historian, and I have a TikTok channel where I talk about the history of perfume. And I had a follower one day who asked me if I could talk a little bit about what kind of perfumes people would have worn aboard the Titanic. And I happened to see this question at like 4 a.m. and I immediately got out of bed. And I just started researching, and I came across the story of Adolf Saalfeld, and he was a first-class passenger aboard the Titanic. He was a German Jew-born immigrant, and he immigrated to England in, I believe, the late 1880s, I want to say. And he was a chemist, and he was the chairman of, I can't remember the name of his company at the moment, but it was a chemistry and distillery company. And we believe that he decided to go aboard the Titanic because he wanted to take a sampling of different raw materials as well as perfume trials to America in the hopes of expanding the business over there. So that is the most likely reason why he was aboard the Titanic. And we don't have like a diary or anything that says like the reason why he booked a ticket, but it's safe to assume that because they recovered the satchels. I believe there were three satchels and they were able to recover two. One of them actually fell out of the whatever that machine is that takes debris from the Titanic debris field up to the surface. And what was so amazing about it was this was, I believe, I want to say the year 2000. And so at that point, the perfumes had been on the bottom of the ocean for about 90-ish years. And when they brought it up to the surface, most of them were still intact, but there were a few that broke, just, the pressure from rising to the surface. And what was so interesting, and you can watch this video, is the researchers who were in the room where it happened, um, they were so moved by it because normally when you're recovering things from the Titanic, there's, really the old water, mildew, like all that, the death sense. And so all of a sudden the room was filled with the scent of flowers. And that was, after 90 years being on the floor of the ocean. And it was this visceral reaction for the people that were in the room. And like I said, there's a video on the internet, you can go watch it. And it's just very moving because we don't really think about perfume having
Mm.
that kind of impact on people, but it really can take you back to a place, to a memory. And what these researchers were saying was that as soon as they smelled, the rose, the lavender, whatever scents were in the room, they were immediately transported back to 1912 and the
Mm.
days when the Titanic was taking off.
That's one of the things that I definitely picked up working around perfume is our sense of smell connected to memory.
Yes.
The typical ones are for me cut grass in July, because I remember cramming for exams at school, and it had these lovely gardens, but they would always be cutting the grass and I could smell the grass. And even though it's a lovely smell, it always takes me back to the dread of summer exams, or, those that idea that that a scent can be that somebody was wearing, many years ago, or a perfume your grandmother wore but she's passed away now. They will immediately, smelling it again will immediately put you back where you were, because it's so strong. But those people didn't even have the memory, but they were probably so connected to what they were discovering from Titanic that they couldn't help but be moved by it. I can imagine that happening.
Yeah.
Jen, explain and please explain the science behind that. Why the aromas were still and the fragrances were still intact.
So the reason why is because so a lot of people will keep their perfume in the bathroom. That I am here to tell you, please don't do that because it ruins the perfume. So even though it was on the bottom of the ocean, kind of ideal conditions for saving your scents because they were in the satchel, they were completely sealed up, and they were in a cold, dark place for 90 years. So that's kind of why they were still very strong. And even the ones that were broken, the reason why they still smelled was because they hadn't been broken the entire 90 years. They were only broken as they were rising to the top. And so that's why the room immediately smelled that way. They were able to reconstruct one of the perfumes. There were, I believe, 62 vials that were recovered. And how they were able to reconstruct, there is a paper readout that you can get that analyzes different scents, and all of the big perfume houses will do that. And it's called a GCMS. And so there were perfumers from Givaudan, which is one of the big two companies that basically make all of the like designer perfumes and stuff that you have on the market. So they had some perfumers from Givaudan who kind of smelled everything and assessed, and they ran the GCMS, and then they found what the different molecules were. And what was so interesting about it was that the majority of the vials that they found were actually raw materials. So they weren't finished perfumes, they were just the raw materials. And there were also a couple of trials of perfumes, meaning they weren't necessarily a finished perfume, but based on these clues, we think that what was happening was that Adolf Saalfeld was going to the US and he was going to show different perfume makers, hey, these are the materials that we have, and this is what you could potentially do with it. The other thing that was really cool about it was at this point in history, most people were wearing single note fragrances. So they would just wear lavender, they would just wear rose, that kind of thing. This changed
Long
in
before Joe Malone thought to start mashing things up.
even before that, even before Chanel number 5. And so like the late 1880s was when Houbigant and Guerlain both started using synthetic materials. Now, people now hear synthetic and they're like, oh, bad, it needs to be all natural. Um, what they actually were created for was because not all natural materials are things that we can use in perfumery. Like if you want to have a belladonna note, like you got to have a synthetic because belladonna will kill you. That's nightshade. So basically, the synthetics were really kind of opening up the landscape of perfumery, and that started in the late 1880s. And what's so interesting about Adolf Saalfeld was that while there were a couple of perfumes that were available at that time that had synthetics, it wasn't until the 1920s that synthetics in perfumes really took off, and that was, mostly with Chanel number 5. That was like kind of the starting point of that. But they found synthetic materials in the satchels. So I think that is so cool because that means that he was kind of one of those people that was ahead of the curve. And
Yeah, pioneer.
yeah, and unfortunately, so fortunately he survived, but unfortunately, um, because he was a man who survived and the preference was given to women and children, he was ostracized. And it sounds like from what has been written about him, things that his family said was that he really was traumatized by the experience. He went back to England and he lived until 1926, and just nothing really happened with the perfume. And it's kind of sad to think that because now that we can see what he was creating and what he was working with, like he maybe would have gone on to such big things if this tragedy hadn't happened.
We hear this a lot about the survivors. They've suffered in immeasurable ways from post-traumatic stress and survivor's guilt and all that kind of thing. I want to go back to what you said about don't keep your perfumes in the bathroom. And is it because of the humidity in a
It's
bathroom? And
yeah,
should we have like a wine I've got a wine refrigerator for my wines. Should we be keeping our perfume in a wine cooler?
I mean, you can do that. I just keep mine in my bedroom and you can just like keep them on a shelf or anything like that. Cabinets are really nice too, but yes, you're right. It's the humidity, it's just like the changes in temperature so much. You want the perfumes to be somewhere very stable, preferably cooler, preferably dark. So again, bottom of the ocean sounds weird, kind of ideal conditions. And what's crazy is this isn't even the first shipwreck perfume that has been recovered. There have been other ones. There's an even older one, the Mary Celestina. So it's actually kind of a thing that we are able to find these perfumes on the bottom of the seafloor and intact.
Mm.
You mentioned in your video about how there really it wasn't gender specific, that men and women wore fragrances, and it wasn't designated just for women or just for men. I'd love you to talk more about that and what kind of fragrances people on the Titanic would have used, men and women, first class or third class. Like what were the common fragrances of the day?
Yeah, that's so interesting. So, the reason why it wasn't specific was because the gender construct in perfume is really a marketing thing. So that really didn't start happening until a couple of decades afterward. And so, like I said before, at the time, people were mostly wearing single note fragrances. And for the most part, perfume wasn't really mass produced the way that it is now. You had, Lubon and Guerlain and Houbigant, like these like very big Paris perfumers. But what most people would do is they would go to their local, pharmacist or whatever, and they would have recipe books that would have the recipes for different types of perfume. So people would know, a certain type of perfume. There's one called I'm going to kill the pronunciation. I'm so sorry. It's Cure de Rus, which is like basically a Russian perfume. And so you would have the name of the type of perfume that you wanted, and you would go to the pharmacist and they would whip it up for you. And that's how most people got their perfumes. Now, in terms of, I can say that for first class passengers, some things that they might have been wearing. Um, there was Jiki by Guerlain, which came out in 1889. And that one is probably the very first perfume hit in history. And so, very likely that that was worn. That one is also often credited as the first perfume to use synthetic molecules, but there was actually one a couple years earlier by
Does that still exist
Silicon.
today? Is that still made
Jiki
or no?
does, Jiki is
Yeah.
still in production. It's a wonderful scent. It is very unisex, actually. I think both, I mean, that's how I feel about all perfume, but I say that because it helps other people figure out like if they'll like it or not. Because
How do you
what,
spell that? I'm Googling it right now because I want to
yeah,
get some. What is it?
yeah,
How do you spell it?
it's Jikky, and that's Jiki. Um, The other perfume
There it
that,
is.
yeah, and that it will definitely smell different now than it did in 1889 because they have to reconstitute different ingredients that are no longer allowed to be used. They used to use a lot of animal products, and we don't really do that as much anymore. The other perfume that I think would have been a hit with First Class Titanic passengers was one that came out that year, and this is a very famous perfume. It's called Kelka Flor. And I can spell that for you too. And again, my French is so bad.
I would
And
imagine that would be very feminine or perceived as feminine because it fleur being flowers, that it would be sort of
yes,
sweet.
and I'm going to tell you a very famous person who wore that perfume on her wedding day, which you could say is probably cursed, Princess Diana. Princess Diana wore Calca Flor, which again was created in 1912, and it's a very beautiful fragrance. When I think of Edwardian perfume, that is what I think of. It to me, it smells like Downton Abbey. It's just very, it's kind of soapy. It's very fresh, very floral, very pretty.
India Hicks was one of her bridesmaids, and
Mhm.
she's you should find her Instagram. She has the most amazing life related to Lord Mountbatten. Her mum was
Mm.
married. I don't know quite the provenance, but she's very connected to the royal family, and her overriding memory was Princess Diana's perfume when they were
Yeah,
waiting to get into the carriage. She was probably 9, but again, she remembers
yeah.
the
Well,
the
we all
the
have
perfume.
childhood scents we remember, whether it was, your mother's cooking or like Alexandra said with the grass as well. And what about like the non-first class passengers? Would there be? I'm imagining they. I recall reading Gone with the Wind as a young person. I read the novel and I remember them talking about Scarlett O'Hara's mother. She always smelled of lemon verbena. Like that was
Yeah.
a recurring thing for her character. And I don't know I don't really understand what lemon verbena means. I just maybe you're stuffing something into the folds of your skirt. What did they do in steerage class to smell better?
Yeah, I mean, like throughout history, what people have done to smell better, especially if you didn't have the money for that, is it comes down to washing your clothes frequently, and they would use different, um, maybe in that case, she was using lemon verbena to scent her clothes with, those little sachets or something like that. They would also use those in the cleaning products that they were making. So those are different ways they could have done it. Again, I think that for people in steerage class, if they were wearing a perfume, they would have been going to the local pharmacy and just getting something there. It wouldn't have necessarily been a name brand, and they would have probably been going after a single note. So, lemon verbena or rose or lavender, things like that. Um,
Can you
And
talk a little bit, Jen, about going back to the Titanic passenger, that he wasn't, we think of perfumery and perfumers and noses as being artists, and they absolutely are when they put these fragrances together. But it's actually, I heard you say they had a chemical company. They were producing chemicals. And one things I discovered was that the same scent that's put in your cleaning products, which is often lemon, or I love Method right now, and they use grapefruit and clementine and all these, you know, very natural sounding fragrances to make your home smell lovely after you've had a clean round. But the very same fragrances they put in those products are where some of these very expensive perfume essences come from, and then they're given to these noses who create their own stories around them. And that was the other thing too, is the stories about how some of these perfumes are put together or become very well known and a hit.
So in addition to having a nose for this business, do you have a science background as well? I mean, you seem to know so much about what goes into
Knows
all of
so
this.
much, Nelson.
Yeah, you know so much in addition
but
to
I'm
just
tips.
enjoying fragrance, which we all do, whether it's a scented candle or something to put on your body.
That's an awesome question. I was actually just having a conversation with somebody about this yesterday. I am self-taught. I do not have a science background. I was an English and philosophy major with an interest in history, and so that's kind of like how all of my worlds collided. But I just came back from France, and one of the places that we were at was at ISITCA, which is the one of the perfume schools. And for people that are, you know, classically trained in France, you do have to have a science background, and you go to a school where you're basically smelling a bunch of stuff and learning how all of the different molecules work together. For me, self-taught, I have been doing this for about 12 years. And so at this point, it's kind of like one of those situations where, like, no, I don't have a science background, but I've been doing it long enough that I just know how it works. And so I think that for Adolf Saalfeld, I don't know if he specifically was the perfumer that created this stuff or if he was overseeing it, what have you. Uh, the headline of the story, though, is that he had some incredible ingredients, and when the noses at Givaudan were analyzing it, they were very surprised by some of the materials that he was using because they were kind of ahead of their time. And the other part of the story is that in 2012, they created a perfume. So I'm assuming it was the perfumers at Givaudan since they were the ones analyzing it, but I don't know who the exact perfumers were. They made a perfume for QVC, and it was called Legacy Titanic. I actually, for this interview, I brought it. I have it right here.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
How
I
does it rank? And I use the word rank on purpose. How does it rank in terms of fragrances in your expert opinion?
So it's very pretty. Like it's kind of honestly, it smells almost exactly like Kelka Floor to me.
Huh.
Um, so like you could put them together and they smell very similar. This is I'm trying to think of like how to say this very nicely. It doesn't have lasting power. So
Mm.
like you'll spray it and like you'll get that fleeting Titanic memory of being, you know, on the grand staircase or in one of the drawing rooms or smoking rooms or whatever. And just like
And what year was that? Did that come out?
this came out in 2012, so it was celebrating the centennial. I mean, that's kind of a weird thing to say, but it was
Commemorating. You're
yeah,
commemorating. Yeah.
commemorating the
Mm.
centennial.
So
Another
of the actual tragedy, it's not a movie related tie-in or anything.
No, it was by, you probably know this better than I do, but it was the company that had the salvage rights that also
Ah,
does the exhibit in
yeah.
Las Vegas. They were the ones that had it made. Something that's really cool, you can't really see it on here, but you can probably find a picture of it online and you can, you know, share that with your listeners. But the image that's on here, it looks like these like little spiraling wrought iron things. This was actually based on one of the recovered doors from the Titanic.
And Dave Condon, our collector broker, has discovered a few of those doors and
Oh,
sold
amazing.
on. Yes, yeah, they filtered out through Mexico when they were literally dumped in a field because it, you know, at the end of every movie they take apart the set. And Titanic at the time was no different because nobody knew, right? And here we
Right.
are 26 years later still talking about it.
Oh
Well,
man.
I'm worried about there's the poor guy that lost his vials and then was disgraced for having the audacity to survive. But I'm curious to find out how he survived. Like, did he get on a boat early on? Did he? Yeah, it's.
Yeah.
I mean, if he was ostracized, it sounds like he got into a boat from the ship. It wasn't like he was picked up in the water or something.
There
But
was a moment though when all the boats, there was like a last boat and nobody else was getting on a boat, and there were a group of men there, and Night Hollis said, just get in the boat, just go. You know, they had shipped off all the women and children. And of course
Yeah.
now it's just a ridiculous thought that you wouldn't just save as many people as you possibly could and just shove everybody in those
Yeah.
half empty boats. That's, you know, when you see that play out in the film or you read about it, it just seems like that was one of the worst tragedies, that many more people, even though there weren't enough lifeboats, many
Yeah.
more people could have survived.
Well, so he did give an account later. Um, and he said that I don't think it was towards the end. I think he got on a boat pretty immediately. And he was saying that he just like followed somebody onto the boat. So it might have been um when they were just starting and didn't realize the magnitude of the disaster yet. That might have been when he got on it. I also saw that he was in, I think they said he was in one of the smoking rooms or something like that, and saw the iceberg, but like we don't know if that was accurate or if that was something that he said after the fact. But he was awake when it happened, and so he was aware of what was going on. And again, he was a first class passenger, so I'm sure that it was faster for him to get out to the decks where they were evacuating people. And so, like, I mean, it makes sense to me. Like, if they didn't really realize that it was going to be as bad as it was. He also said that he thought that there were enough boats for everybody. Um, I mean, I think that we know that's not true. Based on, I think he was probably saying that based on what he was seeing,
I'm
but
sure passengers had confidence. I mean, why
right,
wouldn't they? They perceived this as an unsinkable ship.
It
exactly.
And
was only Rose who did the math, Mr.
yes, only Kate. The Kate Winslet was the only one that could figure it out. Um, as a student of fragrance history, I mean, we're so excited that it led us to you to talk about this as it pertains to Titanic. But do you have a certain era that interests you more than others? Like, you know, maybe you're an ancient Egyptian fragrance fan. What do you gravitate toward?
It's funny that you mentioned the ancient Egyptian one because, like I said, I was just in France and there is a place called the Osmothèque there, and it is in Versailles, not at the palace, but nearby. And that is the first perfume archive in history. And what they do is they get the different formulas for discontinued ancient perfumes, what have
Wow.
you, and they recreate them so that we will always have these smells in, you know, our arsenal. And one of the ancient Egyptian ones was actually my favorite. We smelled 15 from, you know, throughout the millennia, and the ancient Egyptian one was top notch. It was basically just honey and wine, and it smelled incredible. But in terms of my favorite era, that is probably, I would say probably 1920 to about 1950. And the reason why is because that was the heyday of the beginnings of the designers that we know today. So Chanel, Schiaparelli, Dior, they had a fascinating history because they were on both sides of the Nazi situation. And so it's just, if you want some rabbit holes to go down other than Titanic, I would definitely look into Chanel, Schiaparelli, Dior because it's
Interesting.
super interesting. So yeah,
What
that
does
is
your
my,
husband think of all this?
oh,
He living with this woman who's so obsessed with her fragrances.
he he just thinks that I am the biggest nerd, but he is such a dear person, and he just like is excited that I'm excited. He was very happy that I started my shop. So my shop is pretty recent. I've been making perfume under my brand for 12 years, but I only just started a shop in Seattle a couple of months ago. And he
Tell
was,
us about that because as we
Yes.
wind down here,
yeah.
we need to know where we can send people to
Oh,
experience
yeah.
your gifts.
So he was extremely excited when I started it because he was like, "Great, you're going to get all of these antique perfume bottles out of our house. That sounds fantastic." But yes, my perfume shop is in Seattle and it's a working studio. So basically, all of the orders that people make online at my website, immortalperfumes.com, I'm making them there. And then I also take appointments. So if people want to shop, I have not only my perfumes, but I have a select curation of mostly niche and indie brands from around the world. I love, the designer stuff too, but like you can go smell that anywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
I like interesting stuff. And, I keep a lot of my antique bottles and my antique fragrances. I also have the Titanic one there. And so sometimes people will come in and they'll be like, "Oh, I saw your video about the Titanic. Can I smell it?" And I am like, "Say less. Here it is." And then we will just, have fun talking about perfume history. So, yes, I love doing that. And if Alexandra, I know that you live close by. You should definitely come down. We'll smell some
So
Titanic
getting on
stuff.
a ferry, yes.
Yeah, we
And
can
then
also smell we can
please let's
also
go
smell
to
Marie
lunch after.
Antoinette's perfume, like
Oh, how
lots of fun
fantastic.
No, I
stuff.
was going to say the sense memory thing. It's funny how I mean you could just talk all day about these things.
Mhm.
My dad had an aftershave that he used throughout his life called Royal Lime, made in Bermuda,
Nice.
and I read somewhere that Joan Crawford actually used it, even though it was perceived as a man's fragrance, and it really just has a very subtle lime scent. And the only place I can ever find it is Brooks Brothers, and I always have it so that after I shave, I smack some on just to remember my dad. Uh,
Yeah,
so
I have a
it's a
similar thing. My dad wore Stetson, and so I keep it in a drawer. And yeah, like you said, it's a great way to remember my dad and to honor him. And I think, bringing it back to the Titanic perfume, and what we were talking about, memory and everything, even though in life Adolf didn't get to, experience fame or what have you for his perfume creations, it's amazing that, over 100 years later, we are getting to celebrate him and celebrate the things that he created in his life. And I just think that's beautiful.
Mm,
well
yes.
said.
And we find this over and over, don't we, Nelson, that just talking about this ship and talking about these people, it seems like every week we discover a new name and a new story. And of course, that filters into some of the actors that I worked with who played some of the real people on the ship, who got to research and sort of step into the shoes of those characters, or who were not characters, they were living, breathing people
Mhm.
on that ship. And stories, personal stories, you can't beat them because they're true, and to discover them through the world of perfume this time is extraordinary and quite wonderful.
We often say that for such a horrific, disastrous tragedy, uh, positive things came from it.
Yeah.
The least of which is lifeboat safety. But it has spawned generations of artists and scientists and historians and explorers, and we're delighted that we've met you and that you're now part of our Titanic family. And thank you for sharing his story with us and your connection to it. We'll be checking out your fragrances.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been really fun. And like I said, I've been obsessed with Titanic for years. So when I saw your email, I was like, absolutely.
Oh,
Um,
you're a Titaniac, not
I
from
am.
closet now. You can be out with all the rest of us.
One other thing I wanted to tell you
Yes.
guys, for your listeners, is that I know I haven't experienced it, but I know that the big Titanic exhibit, I believe it's in Las Vegas, they have some of the vials there. And I don't know if they're still letting people do this, but they were letting people smell them. So, like that is, if they're ever in Vegas, that's something they can do. I know there's a Titanic exhibit coming to Seattle. I don't think it's the one that has the perfume vials though.
Maybe
So
that's
yeah,
what we should do together. We should go to the Titanic exhibition. That would be
I
really fun.
I am down.
Yes.
Let's let that flag
Thank you
fly.
again.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. And if you'd like to hear more podcasts like this, hit the subscribe button. For information on where you can see Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, go to shipofdreamsfilm.com. Titanic Talk is a production of Ship of Dreams Film Limited. To celebrate Season 2 of Titanic Talk, we've launched a line of Titanic Talk merch. A cap, a mug, a tote, a t-shirt or a hoodie. You'll be sure to find a unique gift for the Titaniac in your life. Look for the link in the notes and on Instagram, or go to bit.ly/Titanic Talk Shop.